We begin. Ini suaranya biar nggak menggema gimana maksudnya? Okay, good afternoon. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much for coming to our second in-person webinar. Sorry, not in-person webinar, but in-person Brownbag. I'm sorry to call it. So we are very happy today to have Dr. Afrimadona. He has led a survey from the last few years, so certainly he knows very much about the political behaviors of Indonesian citizens today. And today we would like to talk about political polarization. So we know from social media, from news coverage that yes, there is polarization, we feel it, but how massive is it, and what causes political polarization? There are still many things that we haven't known yet. So today we invite Dr. Afrimadona to talk about this subject, and he'll talk about leaders-based political polarization. So without further ado, I'll invite Dr. Afrimadona to deliver his talk.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Sirojudin Arif, for introducing me and the topic we're going to discuss today. So this research is actually started a long time ago, in 2019. So it's quite long, long research actually, and so to some extent, the context for the research might be different if we conduct this research again today, for example. So this research started with a project that we conducted of the center. We conducted research about some public policy issues in Jakarta. So this research mostly try to figure out how policy issues has been seen in terms of politics among the voters by voters. So okay, this research is about political polarization. I'm interested in studying political polarization because polarization is can be seen as issues of the day. It occurs in many parts of the world as well. In fact, Arthur and Donahue in 2019, I think there's a publications by and edited volumes by these two authors trying to figure out how polarization has divided democracies around the world. And one of the chapters in the book written by Yves Warburton about polarization in Indonesia. And some scholars of Indonesian politics often characterize Indonesian politics since presidential elections in 2014 until now maybe as being polarized. But the problem is that we lack of clear definitions about what is polarization. When scholars talk about political polarizations, yes, we know that there is a political divisions, political dividedness among two groups, two political groups, two political camps, and but we do not know clear definitions about polarization here, in the sense that polarization refers to what and how we measure over time dynamics of this polarization. So this is the questions that I think I'm interested in investigating, is how do we define political polarization, and how do we approximately measure political polarization in Indonesian context. So most of the studies of political polarization actually occurs in well-established democracies. Yes, they start from the study of political cleavages, but they try to examine much more deeply about political attitudes of some groups, and then they see that how these political attitudes differences then leads to political conflict to a significant extent. And this is how polarization was studied, and I think it is still studied this way up to now. So this polarization, political polarization, a phenomenon that is quite typical in some established democracies with a clear politicization, divide to some extent spill over into some of developing countries. And in Indonesia, some scholars also try to use the word political polarization to characterize the political dividedness of our society. So I think revisiting this political polarization is an interesting thing to do, and this is important as well because political polarization, as we know, that it affects the way democracy works. Yes, it has it has positive contribution to some extent, like it increases political participation, simplify political choices, strengthens political parties to some extent, but it also has a lot of negative effects on the democracy. It leads to policy gridlock, it justifies undemocratic actions by one group toward another, and it extends political conflicts. So that's a problem of political polarization. So that's why studying political polarization in developing countries is also an interesting exercise. Measuring political polarizations. Actually, the literature and the theory about political polarization is quite a lot, but especially it is studied in cases of developed democracies, like in the US especially. And in fact, a study of political polarization in the US has been tried to replicate in some other countries as well. So that's why when we try to define political polarization, we have to look at what has been studied there in the US. So the manifestos of political polarizations, in general, they try to figure out who polarizes over what. When we talk about who polarizes, we have two kinds of polarization here, elite polarization, and the second one is mass polarization. And when we try to figure out over what, we have what we call ideological polarization, referring to political attitudes differences between groups and policy positions between groups. We also have what we call partisan polarizations, referring to partisan animosity. So they are not different. They are not different on one issues only, but over any other issues where the parties take sides. So partisan polarizations, some scholars argue, extend political conflicts to many other issues as well. Not only policy issues, but also some other issues that previously tend to study in terms of balance issues. And then scholars try also think about what we call effective polarization. Many scholars say that political polarization in terms of political attitudes sometimes is too complex to understand by lay people, lay voters. So they think that political polarizations, I think, is something not about political attitudes, but it's about emotions, about emotional feelings, dislike, distrust, and whether or not we want to interact with another from with some others people from another camp. So when we talk about ideological polarizations, this is we see two panels here. The upper one is the most extreme. This is the typical graph. If we see extreme polarization, and the lower one is a typical graph. If we see that the most unpolarized society, so their policy attitudes, their opinions clustered together in the middle, while in the polarized society, their political attitudes diverge extremely. So the strength of measuring political polarization in terms of political attitude is that it is more precise, it is comparable across time, and it can track the degree of polarization. So we can have precise measure of how polarizations evolve over time. But it has also some weaknesses that it might not be applicable to most voters. Political attitude, as I said before, maybe just relevant to those politically sophisticated that can understand policy issues very well, but most other voters cannot do that. And then it is more relevant to well-established democracies where there are some clear policy cleavages in the societies. So this is the ideological polarization. If we try to measure ideological polarization in Indonesia, this is actually the paper that I've published in Journal of Current Civilization Affairs. We can measure political attitudes using several attitude questions. For example, to what extent do you agree or disagree with the statement? The country will be most prosperous if the rule of the law is based on Islamic teachings, for example. So we have several questions. If I'm not mistaken, it's about 19 or 18 something questions. And then if we try to run exploratory factor analysis, and then we can generate three latent factors, what we call latent factors, latent structure that represent policy position across three dimensions. The first dimension is about political secularism. Those who believe that the country will be better if religion is infused in politics deeply, and the ulama get involved in politics deeply. And then the second one is what we call political liberalism scale. It's about state authority. For example, the state has, for example, political stability is more important than political freedom and something else. So it's about political liberalism. And the second one is about economic liberalism. It's something about policy attitudes about redistribution politics, whether foreign trade is good or not, and so on. So this is all the statements that we use in generating these three latent factors concerning policy attitude, or political attitude, about political Islam, about state authoritarianism, and about economic liberalism. And if we try to draw the densities of these policy attitudes, and we try to see the distribution of these policy attitudes between two opposing groups, two opposing groups in our society. As we know that we have two opposing groups. Many scholars noted the polarization as political dividedness between two opposing groups. Jokowi Prabowo in 2014 and 2019, and Anies Ahok in 2017 gubernatorial election. So if we see, and if we plot the densities of policy attitudes or political attitudes between the two groups, we see that the clear differences occur or can be seen in political secularism. So I think this is not surprising, I think, and many scholars trying to study how political attitudes between the two groups, develop over time. Also see that political secularism is the main issues where clear divergence occur between nationalism and Islamism. So if we see here that Ahok Jokowi voters tend to have, to some extent they have very widespread. If you see that, we have studied statistic in class about standard deviation, something like that, and we see that if we grab densities of their political attitudes, we see that very the political attitudes of Ahok Jokowi voters vary greatly. But if we see the political attitudes in terms of political secularism or political Islam dimensions, if we see the political attitudes of Anies Prabowo voters, they tend to cluster a little bit, cluster together, and their position is in the -1, which in this case refers to the conservative side. Surprisingly, in economic issues, we also see that Anies Prabowo voters also cluster in conservative sides, even though to some extent Ahok Jokowi voters also quite conservative, but Anies Prabowo voters is more conservative here. Part of the explanations is that I think Prabowo in his 2019 campaign was much stronger, in terms of they raised issues of economic nationalism and put stronger narrations on these issues. And if we see the main difference between their positions, we see that in terms of political secularism, we have very wide difference between the political attitudes of Anies Prabowo voters on the left, on conservative side, on the terms, and then Ahok Jokowi voters on the positive side, which in this case I quoted the more positive or the higher the values indicate more the more liberal position. And if we try to test multivariate testing for this political polarization, we see that on issues political secularism, there is a statistical significance effect of this political camps. On other dimension, on political liberalism and economic liberalism, political camps does not matter. It means that these two camps are really different on political secular issues. So, but the problem with ideological polarization is that not many voters are aware of and define their ideological position clearly and sort themselves based on this position. That's a problem. Also, understanding issue position is not an easy task. This is a typo. It's not an easy task for most voters. Only sophisticated voters can understand policy issues very well. Also, most parties and voters are pragmatic rather than ideological. Most of the policy debates are not framed ideologically. So no clear signals from the elites to voters which side to choose. And then it is possible as well that polarization is effective rather than ideological. So because policy issues is a more complicated things, then we can surmise that it is possible that polarization is effective rather than ideological. So when we talk about effective polarization, we start from the idea that polarization involves emotions of being part of a group while dislike others on the opposite political groups. That's effective polarization. It is more relevant to I think most societies where parties are not ideological. And so here political polarization start when the marginalized elites or groups coalesce into new formation and mobilize themselves to achieve their political objective. And Carthus and Donahue give 3 criteria to evaluate the degree of polarization. The first one is whether it fuses elites and the masses in large opposing camps, each of which contain its elite and mass bound by strong affection. Second one, whether the country is structured into binary division that dominates the political life, and then whether polarization lasts beyond specific polarizing event or the rule of specific polarizing leader. So I'm interested in testing the first criteria using a survey experiment. So my question is, do leaders polarize voters on policy issues? So the theoretical expectation is that political polarization occurs when some issue positioning is based on leaders making the policy. So when one supports a policy belonging to her leader or rejects the policy met by the leader of different side of the aisle, then it indicates that political polarization occurs. So the hypothesis that I'm trying to verify with this experiment is that when voters know the policy proposing leaders, they are more likely to support the policies of the leaders they previously voted. So we used data, a random sample of 600 adults drawn from Jakarta populations. It is conducted from August to September 2019, so it's been quite a long time ago. It is weighted using iterative proportional fitting weight to equate the characteristic of the sample with those of the population based on age, sex, education, religion, and vote in 2017. So in general, this is the comparison between sample and our populations. This comparison is important so that there is no under sample or oversampling groups in our data. So we randomize sample into 2 groups. Each one consists of 300 respondents. We strictly randomize them, And we call the first group is the treatment group, and the second one is the control group. In the treatment group, the respondents are exposed to policy questions with clear reference to leader or the governor proposing the policy. So, for example, I test 8 policy questions. This is one example. For example, during Ahok's era, flood was managed by widening the river and concretizing the area along the river called normalisasi. During Anies Baswedan's era, flood has been managed by widening the river and then planting trees along the river called naturalisasi. These 2 programs, however, can entail evictions of people around the river, but naturalisasi during Anies era requires more lands so that it risks more eviction if implemented. According to your opinion, which program is more appropriate for Jakarta nowadays? Normalisasi policy during Ahok's era, naturalisasi policy during Anies Baswedan's era. And in the control group, respondents are asked the same questions without being exposed to the name of the proposing leaders. Flood management program can be done in 2 ways. First, by widening the river and concretizing the area along the river, or concretization. And then second, widening the river and planting trees along the river, or naturalization. These 2 programs, however, can entail evictions of people around the river, yet the second program might need more land, so that potentially leads to more evictions. According to your opinion, which program is more appropriate for Jakarta nowadays? The first program, river widening and concretization, or second program, river widening and naturalization. So this is the type of questions that we ask in control and treatment group. And then we try to compare the characteristic of respondent between the 2 groups to make sure that there are some variables that potentially affect the answer. So we try to make sure that the characteristics, the democratic and political characteristic between the 2 groups are really balanced. And if we see this covariate balance check, we see that all in demographic and political characteristics of the 2 groups, they are balanced. And then in policy support and exposure, so we compare the answer in these policy positions, and if we see here, it's very too small, but hopefully you can see that, for example, in terms of both Anies and Ahok voters, if we see that, especially in Anies voters, when Anies voters do not know the policy proposing leaders or simply read the questions, so they tend to support Ahok's policy positions here. But when they know that this policy belongs to Ahok versus belongs to Anies, then they support Anies policy positions. So we see there are several policy positions here where we examine reverse positions, where when they do not know Anies, when they do not know that the policy belongs to Anies Baswedan, for example, they based on their understanding, they choose Ahok's policy. But when they know that the policy belongs to Anies, then they choose Anies positions. So this can be seen in flood management policy, and then reclamation policy, and street vendors policy, and then it is this 4 policy positions. I think it is clear, and public service policy as well. Okay, and if we see that in general, if we see the difference, but even though in some other policy issues there is no reversal of positions, still when they know that the policy belongs to Anies Baswedan, they tend to support these policy positions. compared to when they do not know the leaders who propose the policy. So in all of the policy questions that we ask, we see that there is, especially for honest voters, there is positive differences between treatment and control, which means that their support for policy increases when they know that the policy belongs to honest Sweden, and so the support for this policy is higher when they know that the policy belongs to honest Sweden, and they tend to support some policies, when they do not know that the policies belongs to honest Sweden. So here we see that, especially for honest voters, the differences between treatment and control statistically significant. So the questions then is, under what conditions can name identification strongly affect this leader-based policy polarization? And for whom does this name identification matter when giving opinions on policy issues? So we try to detect 4 conditioning variables, or 4 interaction variables. The first one is partisanship. We try to see whether name identification especially matter when these voters are part of parties. They identify themselves with the parties who supported honest in 2017. And then we also try to see whether emotional attachment to the leaders matter as well, and then political knowledge and religiosity. And if we see here, in both honest voters and voters, we see that we see here that especially feeling thermometers especially matter. Feeling thermometers and support for honest coalition is especially matter in policy decisions by these voters. And we see that political knowledge seems to moderate the effect of this name identification on issue positioning. And I think this is hopefully a little bit clearer in terms of marginal effect of feeling thermometer. So what this graph says that when voters like honest Sweden so much, then a name identification strongly affect their positions on policy. I mean, when they like honest Sweden so much, then their name identification strongly affects their position on policy issues. So here we see that in terms of treatment, there is steep graph here compared with a control group. So it indicates that the feeling thermometer of honest Sweden strongly affects the way name identifications affect policy positions. And then in terms of party coalitions, we also see that party coalitions strongly affect the relationship between name identification and policy position as well. That those who were in part of coalitions of honest Sweden here defined as those feeling identified themselves with Gerindra Party, and then PKS and PAN, Prosperous Justice Party, and National Mandate Party. When those who are part of this coalition tend to support honest policy position when they know that this policy belongs to honest Sweden. And then for political knowledge, we see that the graph is all of them are a little bit flatter. It indicates that to some extent that political knowledge can moderate the effect of name identification. It means that those who have good knowledge, political knowledge, understand the issues, then name identification doesn't matter very much. And then the last one is religiosity. Religiosity, to some extent, they affect policy position, but it varies. The effects varies. Some policy positions is not affected by religiosity, but some policy position is affected by religiosity as well. And then what can we learn from all of this is that when voters know the policy proposing leaders, they tend to sort themselves with the policy of the voted leader. However, when they did not know the policy owner, then they tend to evaluate policy rationally. Yet this is especially evident in honest voters. It seems to us that leaders seems to be an important signal to policy attitude. Thus, knowing the policy owner can activate the effective polarization, that is supporting policy position based on their likes and dislike of the policy ownership. And then some factors such as partisanship, emotional attachment to the leaders, and religiosity to some extent amplify the relationship between name identification and policy support. It means that those having stronger partisanship, feeling positive about the leaders, and are religious are more likely to support honest policy position when they know that the policies belong to honest. And political knowledge seems to undermine the relationship between name identification and policy position. Those who know the policy well or experience the policy implementation might not be affected by the leadership identifications of the policy. So I think that's what I can talk this afternoon. Thank you, Pak Sibo.
Okay, thank you very much, Mas Fahri. Thank you for your very interesting talk. I learned many things and many new things about Indonesian voters as well as Jakarta voters. Initially, I thought that the voters are polarized in many different aspects. But now you told me that, not only me, you told us that actually the relationship between religion and the state is the most contentious issues on the voters. It is the most issues that divide the voters across two lines. While when it comes to economic ideologies and probably other matters, actually they come a little bit closer together rather than when they talk about the secularization issues. That's one thing. But policy is different from ideology. When it comes to policy, it seems that the voters or the citizens do not know much about what they actually would like the government to give them. So even though they have a clear position in terms of religion and the state relationship, but regarding the policy, they just follow the leaders. That's what I get from your research. Well, I have some questions, but I think I'm afraid it's not fair if if I ask you first, probably from the students. If you have some questions, I'll open the session for 2 or 3 questions. Or if you're still thinking, let me start with my question, Mas Satri. So for some of us, probably it's not so clear what is actually the difference between polarization and just differences. Why is it why polarization matters? Why we should talk about polarization as different things compared to differences or heterogeneity? Why? What is the difference actually? That's my my basic questions. The second one, regarding your finding that the voters actually they just follow the leaders in terms of the policy. So I have a question of what explains this these behaviors. probably you can talk more about the condition under which leaders matter, whether the effect varies across groups, for example. If it's about the political knowledge, I assume it should be different. The effect of leaders should be different between the high educated and the lower educated people, for example, or between low income and high income voters, for example. And the second question is, why do leaders say normalize the differences? So you say that actually they have differences in terms of the ideology, especially related to religion and state relationship. But when it comes to policy, it seems that the differences in ideology becomes normalized by the leaders, regardless of whether they are left or on the left or on the right side. The way they think about the policy becomes influenced by the leaders that they choose. What explains this? Why leaders become so powerful or influential in Jakarta? Even in Jakarta, when we come to Jakarta, is among the cities in which politics become sophisticated, people more educated than other areas.
Yeah. So the first question is, what is the difference between simple differences and polarization? So polarization is a political terminology that used by scholars to characterize differences between two political groups in general, two opposing groups, but in terms of they refer to in terms in our context in political polarizations is differences between two political groupings. So like in the US, for example, we have polarizations between Democrats and Republicans. It is a big political groupings. And in some other countries, they also see that these political groupings occur, and these political groupings created some differences among the voters as well. So they have clear position on some issues, and some others have a clear position on some of the issues as well. And these policy positions by the elites especially then affects the way their voters see the issues as well. So it leads to your second questions about why leader matter. Yeah, because leaders is to a significant extent is a signal to read the political phenomena. Most studies see that even in well-established democracies as well, and in developed democracies as well, like in the US, for example, most studies, I think, argue that voters, sophisticated voters, is very few. So we have very few sophisticated voters. Most voters try to understand political phenomena, try to understand policy issues when they refer to their leaders. For example, when they are asked about foreign policy, they know that if they are Democrats in the US, for example, in the US context, for example, when they are asked about foreign policy issues, then they know that as a Democrat, and because the policy position of Democratic Party on foreign policy issues in this way, for example, much more humanitarian and so on, and then they also support that policy as well. But if we ask them clearly about specific foreign policy issues and even some geographical locations in the world, they do not know that exactly where Iraq is, for example, where Sudan is, for example. They do not know. So they do not understand many policy issues. So even in the US, where we know that it is developed countries. So and some scholars try to conduct a research on policy behavior, and most of them argue that politically sophisticated voters is actually very few in many other societies. So understanding the policy issues, which is very complex, gaining information about the benefits and the cost of the policy is a very complex task that cannot be done by lay voters. So when they are asked about policy issues, then the main signals, the main insights that inform them, that inform their opinion about policy is the signal from the leaders.
Oh, it is very striking that you said political sophisticated voters are very few. I thought their numbers are many and increase with the rest of education, but probably you can talk about it later. But before that, if you have a question, please raise your hand. Okay, Pak Philip.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Afri, for your insightful presentation. I have it's not really a question, but I want to start with what Pak Siro already mentioned, and you also mentioned about sophisticated voters. It seems that you assume the more sophisticated voters would not engage in some kind of a polarizing behavior. Okay. And then I think we need to check this because there's a book I just as you presented your paper, I tried to remember the author, so I go to Amazon. There's this book titled "The Urban Voters" by Kaufman. She for 20 years did research in mayoral election in the United States, and actually she found out that polarizing election took place in cities across the urban voters actually, and they do have better education. So it's actually the opposite. The more sophisticated you are, at least in her research, then the more likely polarization take place during election time. So maybe it's not the level of education, but it's rather the nature, the circumstances surrounding the city or metropolitan areas like Jakarta. So it's probably because it's some kind of actually migrants or people coming from different parts of the countries with different ethnicities. So they tend to be more likely to engage in some sort of affiliative politics, if you will, right? And then normally in urban areas, they have these groupings. People coming from Malang, for example, maybe they have some sort of paguyuban here, in Jakarta, or people from Makassar, they do have groupings. They meet, in certain times, frequently, regularly, and so on. So they are actually readily to be mobilized because they have some sort of structure. And I think it happened during the Jakarta election time. At the time that you are doing your research, mobilization is easy because there is a structure of this, ethnic groups, Forum Betawi Rempuk, yes, or other kind of, this ethnicity-based or religious-based organization tend to be stronger in cities, and then it becomes more easy to be mobilized. That's some kind of a paradox from other research that I found. So okay, if you could comment on that.
Thank you, Pak Philip.
Thank you, Pak Philip.
You would like to respond to that comment?
Yeah, I think yeah, that's right. And some others research, I think I forget, Donald Green and his co-authors about the social perspective of voting behavior, arguing that sometimes our identity our group identification matter a lot in political mobilization and voting behavior. I think it is. I think I should take into considerations this comment.
Okay, thank you, Mas Afif. Okay, Saima. Okay.
So, have more clarification on that. Has light polarization was it successful to, has a light polarization altered the way citizens arrive at their policy opinions in the first place? And if so, in how and in what ways?
How?
In what way?
In what way leaders?
Yeah, like light polarization, has it altered the way citizens arrive at their policy opinions in the first place? And if so, how? What way? By what ways?
Yeah, in terms of polarization, can help, as I said before, that to some extent polarization it has a positive aspect as well, in the sense that it simplifies political choices. So in political polarizations, we know that if I'm in this group, then I should choose this one, because for my group, this is the policy that I should support. In polarization condition, in polarization society, we expect that some voters in cluster in one group might not want to support the policy from the other side. So in polarization situations, political choices is simplified, and leaders give clear signal to these policy simplifications. Is it what you asked?
Or if related to that question, if you can give us more, say, stories about the way the ideas from the elite get into the mass. Is there any, say, social mechanism or say what people call as social mechanism? How the elite ideas shape the mass? Is it because of the news, or whether it might happen under certain circumstances?
Yes, in general, in effective polarization, voters often do not need to know very much about the policy issues. They just need to know that if they heard that their leader, positioning themselves about on these issues, on one political side of the issues, then they will choose the policy. So they simply try to know that how the leader position themselves in one issues, without having to know very much, very deep about the issues being discussed. So they understand it from their discussion with their peers, or mostly they know this from the news as well. In some other research in the US, for example, voters tend to understand policy issues based on the news, where their leaders give comment about some policy issues, like trade or foreign policy. So I think this is the way voters understand policy issues. So they just get information about what issues it is and how the leaders positions themselves on the issues.
Okay, thank you. I see some other hand raised. Okay, I'm.
Can we move to the process of polarization to be if the polarization increase will be more negatively to democracy more than positive like that. Can we have measurement to decide if this polarization will be more risky for democracy more than positive effect?
Okay. In general, if we try to understand policy rationally in terms of, so if we assume that pluralism in the sense that we cluster together in the middle, we see policy very rationally based on the benefits or the cost of the policies to the society or even our personal interests, then I think, yeah, that's the most ideal situations for sure. But the problem is that sometimes some policies, give the benefits that there is not equal to some segment of the society. Some policies, advantage some societies or some part of the societies, the rich, for example, and cost the poor, for example, and so on. So in these situations, is that people begin to think in terms of their ideal policy positions. So I think pluralism, if we assume that if we define pluralism in the sense that we allow many differences, okay, if that's what we mean by pluralism, we allow any difference in opinion, difference in policy positions, and whose policy position is more rational and more acceptable. That's what we choose. Then it would be good. But again, it creates complications among the lay voters sometimes, in the sense that they have to think a lot of opinion coming into their mind. So sometimes they are difficult to make decisions. So that's the problem if we define pluralism in terms of allowing a lot of differences in policy debates and so on.
Okay, Mas Ridwan.
Okay, thank you, Pak Siraj, Pak Afri, for your interesting and informative presentation. It's common in the people that political polarization during the election is still occur, I think, until now. But you explained quantitatively about the political polarization, but I need to know a bit more about how people can be polarized. Pak Philips mentioned about sophisticated people. It's not easy to be polarized. But if I don't know if you can use another lens of theories, for example, framing or resource mobilization.
Yes.
Because if we use this movement theories like framing, what kind of framing they use to polarize voters?
Yeah.
I think I need to know more about that and how they mobilize resources. I think they have agency to do that, to polarize voters. Maybe you have some findings.
Yeah. In terms of how elites frames the issues and polarize voters, for example, in 2019 election, for example, in the campaign, we often heard some jargons of economic nationalism, for example, how we should not, do not rely on some others. We have to rely on ourselves. We need to restrict import, restrict export, and so on. That's some, economic nationalist narrations that bit by bit try to be understood by voters, and that's why to some extent in the survey also find some evidences that even on economic issues, to some extent there is some differences between the two camps. So I think the way, yes, the way leaders frame the issues, affect the way voters understand the issues as well. And then, to a significant extent, leaders also try to justify their policy position in terms of who they defend. For example, in terms of what is street vendor policy, for example, in Tanah Abang, street vendor policy on this position try to defend street vendors because it represents the poor, and then they try to frame the issues in terms of how we defend the poor and create the policy for the welfare of the poor. And when this framing is understood by the voters, and the voters can also position themselves as well in terms of this policy. I think, yeah, framing plays a very important role in shaping voter position and policy as well.
Okay, thank you, Mas Afri. Is there still any other question? Okay, Ramita, I don't see clearly. Right.
Sorry?
Stocks.
Oh, okay. Yep. Yeah, I think they are part of the one that can be easily mobilized. So yeah, but in terms of I don't know, because I do not know I did not do ethnographic study studying how thugs, for example, come to people and then debating these issues as well. Maybe fact plays important role in polarizations because they can be easily mobilized, but I do not know whether they play important role in shaping policy positions. So in terms of polarization, if we define polarization as I said, in terms of policy position, I think they do not play important role because they do not take part in framing the issues in this or that. It is the elites that frame the issues. So I think in this case, fact maybe is the instruments for political polarizations, on the ground, but not in terms of ideational aspect.
Okay, thank you, Mas Afri. I think I also see Saimah, you raise your hand.
I just wonder that do political polarization descends to be a social polarization as well, and to what extent?
Yes, some scholars see that political polarization extends conflict, not only political conflict, but also social conflicts as well. To some extent, yeah, we see it in this country. Like, for example, previously they were friends, and then their social relations breaks down when they know that his or her friends choose the other political sides. So to some extent, political polarization can affect social relations as well. And I think this does not occur in this country as well. In some other countries also occur. In the US, for example, even father and son, they did not talk for too long simply because they have different political positions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mas Afri. So, if I might have other questions, Mas Afri. One is actually political polarization or social polarization. Is it a matter of degree or a kind? I mean, you said that to some extent there are some benefits from polarization, but commonly people will say that it's negative. So, but probably the extent to which polarization might affect negatively or positively might be different across issues. Or so is it actually type that polarization is negative thing, or actually it depends on the degree. I mean, there can be maximum point in which if we have that point, actually polarization can be beneficial. But beyond that point, either more polarized or less polarized, actually we can have negative. That's my first question. The second is related to issues. Is polarization is it negative in all issues, or actually it will be dependent on context? For example, in Indonesia, you say that political secularism is the most decisive issue, while economic issues actually are not that problem. And your experiment is on economic issues, not on religious issues. So in the economic issues, it can be, yes, because the voters actually are quite similar. So they in that situation, the differences in the political choice in terms of the leader matters for them. But in religious issues, probably it can be different. Or in more nuanced question, if leaders frame the economic issues with religious languages, religious terms, probably can be different. What do you think about these two issues?
Yeah, the first one is in terms of the degree or types, whether political, under what conditions maybe political organizations positively or negatively affects democracy in general. Maybe that's what I understand. It depends. The first one is if we try to measure political polarization in terms of quantitative measurement, like for example the degree in the US, for example, political polarization is measured by the policy positions of the elites, for example, the members of the Congress, for example. So we can measure polarization in this way, and the good one is that the benefits is that if we measure this polarization quantitatively like this, we can see the degree of polarization, and if we can see the degree of polarization, then we can relate this kind of measurement with some other issues. So under the situations that we can see that whether some degrees of polarization can positively affect or some other degrees can negatively affect. So it depends on the situations. For example, my research about US polarization in terms of economic sanctions, the durations of economic sanction in the US that I published in Contemporary Politics, for example, it shows that that too low polarization and too high polarization is actually better, because it affects the policies. Because this too low or too high polarization is better, because it allows them to cooperate. Okay, to cooperate. If they do not, if they cannot cooperate, then in terms of economic sanction at the time, then because the mechanism of sanctioning in Congress, sanction can be terminated if Congress can unite it together. They can unite, and then they can block the president's decision to terminate sanctions. So under these situations, then some degrees of polarization can give benefit, but some others are not. So we can see that there is a curvilinear relationship between the degree of polarizations and the durations of economic sanction.
Sorry, to interrupt you. In other way, actually, low polarization is good, high polarization is good, but moderate polarization is bad.
Yes.
Is that your point?
Yes, moderate polarization, because moderate polarizations allow Congress to unite and block the president's decision to terminate sanctions. So, this is some cases, but some other cases might be different. But this is the benefits of measuring polarization in terms of the degree.
It's a kind of paradox. That
Yeah.
moderate is bad right now.
Yeah, see, I just would like to add. So, seems to me that this polarization is much depend, or we need to pay attention on the context as well as the purpose of using the level of polarization. So in a different context, different levels of polarizations might mean different. So can I say something like that?
Yes.
Okay, so polarization statistically, then it is important there is mechanism on how to measure polarizations, and then how to use it. It depends on the purpose of measuring the polarization. Because in some cases, like domestic political, in the case of that you mentioned about, we have Anies, we have Ahok. So both of these two contenders, they will maximize the polarizations of the society based on their purpose. You know, well, whether the one candidate, for example, would like to use the high polarization that support him, or making lower level of polarization for the enemy, something like that. Is it?
Yeah, in general, a different level of political polarizations, they have different dynamics and different effects of the democracies. Some others that on some issues, moderate polarization might be good, but some others might be not. In my case, it is not good because the issue is about sanctioning, Congress sanction, and in the U.S. context, for example, sanction can be terminated by the president, but the president cannot terminate sanction if Congress united and block sanctions. So that's in the context. But on some other contexts, many scholars say that moderate polarization might be good, because too low polarizations will make the policy diffusion, the policy plurality, is very high. So it is very difficult for doing internal consolidations among groups. That's the problem if the polarization is too low. That's based on literature. But if the polarization is too high, then it is very difficult for intergroup cooperations. That's the problem as well. So that's why moderate polarization on some other situations is good, but in some other settings might be problematic. But in general, cooperation is still can occur if we have kind of moderate polarization. So on the one hand, we have we can still build internal consolidations within groups, but on some others, meanwhile, we can still have intergroup cooperations under moderate polarization situations.
It seems that it can be another direction of your research. Under what condition actually polarization is good or bad?
Yeah, I think yeah.
Okay, that other questions from the floor? Yes, Majelo.
What I read on the slide that polarization is an emerging political trend all across different parts of the world, especially in democratic developing countries. So, if it is a trend, I'm just curious. I would like to ask in the conditions of Indonesia if there might be an external force that is affecting the Jakartan population. That's why they tend to go polarizing. Or at some point, another question is that pre-Jokowi term, is there already polarization phenomenon in Indonesia or let's say in Jakarta? Because if it is defined as a trend, but the emerging factors or the mitigating factors, that's why it is happening, like ideological or partisanship of the populace is already happening way before, even before 2014. So I think, does it really mean that once the society is fragmented, it's already polarized?
So what was, sorry, what is the key question?
So, so my question is, since I think I saw somewhere in the slide that global polarization is somewhat like emerging trend in still all across different parts of the world. So that polarization is already happening pre-2014 in Jakarta or even in the entire Indonesia, and is it also is domestic politics also a factor in affecting Jakartans' voting decisions?
Okay, so what's the political polarization? Does political polarization exist before 2014? Okay, yeah. Actually, we have a history of political cleavages in 1950s. I think, yeah, scholars of Indonesian politics know that we have, been divided on the issues of Indonesian ideology and so on and so on. And the key issues is what we call political Islam as well. So that's why, because we have the history of these sort of issues, then it is not surprising that it is on political Islam dimension that the differences are still evident up to now. But it is this political Islam differences had been tried to stabilize during the new order. So in the new order, then we have tried to what we call the ideologize Indonesians. So we have Pancasila as our single ideology. So Islam cannot be the basic principles of any organization, and so on and so on. So that's during the authoritarian rule of order. But when the order collapsed, then some political parties, were established themselves, and then they try to define their political movement in terms of on these issues. And that's what I think, has been sharpened during 2014 and especially 2017 gubernatorial election.
Okay, thank you, Mas Afri. Now we still have 10 minutes, so if you still have questions, so this is the time for you to raise your questions. Or is it enough? Okay, Ali.
Why we don't ensure the long effect of polarization? So we can for the government and give some policies about what the type of polarization should the politicians not use, like ideological polarization had a long effect for social and also for political. So why we don't ensure the long effect of the polarization for the society and political science?
Oh, why don't we measure long effect of
Polarization on society and also political? Because ideological polarization only has long effect on society and also on political.
Yeah, actually, it is difficult for now to measure the long-term effect of ideological polarization because based on many research about trying to measure this political polarization, especially in terms of political attitudes, use what we call a cross-sectional survey. So in cross-sectional survey, we ask these questions and then we try to measure it. And I think not in many surveys, we ask these sort of questions. So that's why we do not try to measure its long-term effect, because if you want to measure the long-term effect of polarization, at least we need to have kind of some longitudinal data to try to know the extent of political polarization at one particular time and then relate to the phenomena at a time, and then try to measure at another time the extent of political polarization on another time, and then relate to political phenomena at the time. And then we see the trend. And then if we can do that, we can predict if this polarization occurs this way and this might affect that way. But unfortunately, we still have no kind of some longitudinal data to measure this political polarization.
Hopefully, we can develop such kind of data in the future, or probably not individual, but aggregate measures.
Yes,
I don't know how to do that. Okay, now let me call the last questions. If you still have a question, okay, Nufus.
According to your survey, you make some forecasting for the condition of Indonesia polarization affecting the election 2024, whether it will be increased or decreased. How do you feel?
At least from the survey, because the survey is conducted closer to election, it seems that our polarization tend to increase during the political years, and it's around election time, before or after election. So I think yes, political phenomenon increases political polarization to a significant extent. If we try to run a survey nowadays and try to ask the same questions, I'm not sure that we will find this, you know, the polarization as that extreme, like in 2017 or 2019.
So there's a conclusion that this polarization is also made by design by the politician.
Yes, that's why my suggestion is that elites play a very important role in shaping this polarization, because it seems that polarization increases during the political time, and because during political times, elites, are very active. They always, go to their voters and then talk about policy issues. So I think yes, I do not say that it is by design, but whether it is intentional or not, their elites' behavior play a very important role in shaping this polarization. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Nufus. Now we only have 4 minutes, so I think it's time to conclude this meeting. Thank you very much, Nasafri. I think you have taught us many important things. We have talked about many interesting facts, and I'm afraid I cannot do enough justice to summarize all of them. But if I might say one thing is, what we have discussed so far indicate the importance of studying what we might call elite politics, or elite and voters linkages. So in the last, say, several decades, we studied many things but elite. We studied political behaviors of the mass. We studied, when it comes to contentious politics, we studied the social movements in terms of the people. When political economists come to the issue of institutions, they study how institution works, but few study how the elite shapes political outcomes, and how elite shapes the masses, and how elite masses linkages might affect many important political outcomes. And I think as an approach, elite masses linkages can be applied to many different issues. Whether in terms of political, say, elections, or even war, that elite and mass linkages may affect the outcomes of the war, for example. So I think for the next, research, if you have chance, it is good to see how elite and elite mass linkages shape our daily life. So do you want to say the last few words?
No. Yeah.
Okay, if no, I think we can end here and see you in the next Brownbag seminar. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.